Welcome to Norse Code, the number one podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I'm your host with the most, Dusty O'Connell, joined as per usual by Minnesota Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human, Arif Hassan. How you doing, Arif?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm actually very well. I'm taking a short vacation from everything, not just the podcast, like from actual work, to go to a wedding in Chicago where I don't really want to get into too many of the details of it right here, but I have a lot of like work related, like bar and restaurant related, like Denver related popcorn drama to share with a bunch of my closest friends. And I also spent like all day today shopping and got the most adorable outfit and the hugest piece of luggage for remarkably great prices. So it's been and I got a really great haircut. Like, my hair is notoriously difficult to cut. It's
notoriously. Yes, we've all shared stories about how difficult your hair is to cut.
Well, my barbers have. And I can tell like within 1 minute of the start of the haircut whether somebody has like cut hair like mine in the style that I wear mine before, just by their like first few motions. You know, it's all about the explosive push off. And then, pistoning your legs and potentially swimming through blocks.
So when you walk into the salon or the barbershop or whatever it is it like there's a bunch of conversation and it just stops as you walk in?
Well, no. I mean, like, so my strategy is usually to go to one of two different Floyd's 99 barbershops. This is an unpaid endorsement of Floyd's because they generally do a pretty great job. 80% of the time, I'll get someone that has a ton of experience that just like dives into my hair and starts doing it the right way. And then 20% of the time, within 2 minutes, I'm like, well, I'm probably gonna need a haircut in like 2 weeks.
You serve as a good training prop then.
I actually literally did once. In fact, the most expensive and worst haircut I ever got was at this barber shop where the girl had clearly never cut somebody with like fine, like lay flat hair like mine. And she actually had to like bust out her Who Wants to Be a Millionaire phone a friend. Like she pulled the barber manager over and was like, help. Like I could see her getting nervous in the mirror as she was cutting, like she was fucking up and didn't know what she was doing. But she eventually had to pull the manager over and be like, hey, and without saying like, I screwed this up, how do I fix it? Like what do I do here? Kind of thing. And I'm just like sitting there the whole time like I can see my hair, you guys. I know you're not.
Hey, what's the best way to maximize this kind of hair, manager?
And not only did he give her correct advice, I ended up leaving with an acceptable haircut and a coupon for a free one for the next time.
So it wasn't the most expensive.
Well, this particular one was. The next one was the least expensive.
Yeah, but because of the first one, you got the next one. You should divide that one by 2.
I'm not averaging haircuts.
You should. It was free.
All right, Dr. Pedantic.
What's this show if we don't argue about stupid stuff?
Well, the last thing I'll say about this is that the same barber manager that saved my haircut also told me that I had been parting my hair on the wrong side.
Oh, wow, that's a revelation.
For literally my entire life, 34 years old, and no one, I've gotten dozens of haircuts, tens of haircuts in 34 years, and no one had the guts to tell me, hey, bud, you're parting your hair on the wrong side.
And I can't imagine that the fashion geniuses of Grand Forks, North Dakota admitted that error.
It wasn't just Grand Forks. I've definitely gotten haircuts at least one other place in 34 years. But what it displayed to me was a total like system of cowardice that kind of belies the whole hairdresser industry. But this dude not only taught his protege some stuff about how to cut fine hair, but also taught me something about myself. And I parted my hair on the other side. It looks great, and I've never looked back.
Fantastic.
Norse Code is brought to you by you, the listener, and not hairdressers specifically.
Unless the listener is a hairdresser.
Well, as long as they
we appreciate you, hairdresser.
Well, I love hairdressers too, especially talented ones, and I can tell very quickly. I guess I didn't make that clear. But if you are a hairdresser who would like to support Norse Code, you can make a one-time donation in any amount you'd like at paypal.me/Norse Code. A $5 donation or greater, along with a shipping address, will net you one of our sweet Norse Code stickers. I've given away a handful of them to people that are traveling overseas. So, as terrible as the Miami game was, I definitely got a kick out of the Twitter heat map that they had during the broadcast.
Oh yeah.
And it made me kind of wonder, oh, hey, this is pretty similar to the podcast download heat map that we have access to. And I don't know.
I thought it was pretty cool. I'm kind of wondering, how accurate those things can be, because the location services for Twitter are not always great. But yeah, it was pretty cool.
Well, and plus, NFL Network was only broadcasting the game in 4 European countries and self-selecting samples and all that. Not scientific by any stretch, but still kind of neat. And I liked it for kind of the relative parallels to the Western European downloads and the Western European contributions we've gotten, which is something that we always marvel at. And we would not have access to kind of our own podcast download heat maps without the contributions of listeners like you. That's a feature that we pay a little extra for on Libsyn. And
it's really cool, because initially, when people were downloading Norse Code, we thought that some Scandinavian rockers had accidentally misclicked. But I think at this point, people have kind of figured out that we're a football podcast, so we really appreciate it.
Well, yeah, and I think that first year that was a legitimate consideration, but in the 4 years that have come after that, we've seen that either people are really stubborn about believing that Norse Code, the number one podcast for your Minnesota Vikings, might actually be Scandinavian death rock, or that we really are just the number one podcast for your Minnesota Vikings with a dedicated following that spans the globe. So thank you for that. And if you would care to become a recurring contributor to Norse Code, patreon.com/Norse Code is the place to go. At the $5 a month donation level, we will send you a sticker, and you can wear your Norse Code pride on your backpack, or perhaps your giant piece of luggage, or your vehicle, or your laptop, or wherever a big fat fine sticker belongs. So show your love for Norse Code. Give us a couple bucks. Your money goes to letting us, see the granular data of where you come from and better tailored content. It allows us to do things like upgrade our own equipment. You may notice that Arif and I sound as though we're in a studio together. We are not. We are still 1,000 miles apart, separated by 2 tin cans and a very long string. But the glorious dulcet tones of our voices are brought to you by you, the listener. So, thank everyone for supporting us so far, and also thank you to those who will support us in the future. We do have one significant upgrade coming up for the regular season, something a little bit different than literally every Norse Code episode you've heard in the past. And when you tune in next week in advance of the Saints game, you will immediately know what it is. And of course, we will have a 3-man pod. The old band is getting together. We're like LCD Sound System, except we didn't lie about breaking up 6 years ago. We will all be on stage, relatively speaking, in advance of the Saints game. So check that out. And also, this is pretty much your last chance before the season starts. I don't know if you still have any fantasy drafts left. I know everybody else likes to sell big fantasy guides or whatever, but in the event that you have been considering Vikings players for your fantasy team, or just want to know more about the Vikings in advance of the season, make sure you check out Arif Hassan's 2017 Vikings guide, available at zonecoverage.com or through a link in the menu at norsecodepodcast.com.
Yeah, just a final pitch for the guide. If you're watching the Vikings and you see something that they do that, you're kind of like, why did they do that? What would the schematic purpose of the Vikings doing that be? There's a good chance that the guide has, somewhere near a reasonable answer to that question. There's schematic breakdowns of what the Vikings do in the offense and the defense. The differences between Pat Shurmur and Norv Turner. Try to see what is driving. Maybe there's a particularly short passing game in a game, and you want to know why. The Vikings were passing so short. Is it just because the offensive line is designing? There's answers in the guide to those sorts of questions, and then also there's a bunch of history of a bunch of the players in the Vikings, their strengths and weaknesses, what they do and what they don't do, and a couple of things about like the kick return game and so on. So there's definitely a lot of value for the Vikings guide going towards the season, especially if you want to become more familiar with the players of the scheme. And it's also a way to support my work, so I'd appreciate it.
Yeah. So I guess speaking of why the Vikings did things they did, let's I guess maybe collectively look at the two terrible preseason games that we have to recap, and then maybe take a look at some of the individual performances and some of the individual quirks before moving on to the much more interesting cut and trade section of the show, and then address a couple of questions in the mailbag. Does that seem like a plan?
Yeah, no, that sounds like a great plan.
Cool. So I feel like, well, okay, one, we had no business winning the San Francisco game. I mean, we had no business being as far behind as we got, given last week's conversation about just like, and I guess we maybe set ourselves up for it when I talked about how San Francisco was a giant tomato can with a garbage quarterback, and then I spent the whole first half wondering why they kept scoring and we just couldn't do anything. Like, we appeared to be handcuffed on both sides of the ball.
Yeah, we wrote our own script by it's kind of like the actual regular season game against San Francisco at the beginning of 2015. We wrote the script for our inevitable demise. Yeah, I mean, obviously the game itself, was fun to watch as like a whole game narrative, right? Because, I mean, the Vikings won, but that's irrelevant because the starters certainly did not win by any reasonable stretch of the imagination. So the Vikings starters end the preseason in that game because they didn't play in the second or in the final game with 3 points scored on, I want to say, 14 drives or something like that. It was pretty abysmal.
Well, so what the heck?
Yeah, well, so, there's a couple of questions like, why is this the case? Is it going to continue? What about the San Francisco and Seattle games? Tell us, stuff about the future. And, one clue I would take a look at, you could take a look at PFF's review of the game, and you don't have to look at, how the players on the Vikings did. That's something that I kind of don't agree with. You could take a look at how the players on the 49ers did. That's something I do agree with. 4 of the top 5 players are edge defenders. Why would it be that 4 of the top 5 players from the 49ers were edge defenders? Might it be because the Vikings' offensive line was awful? I would posit yes. That is the reason. We had an unusually poor game from Nick Easton, who I believe has now lost the center battle in large part because of his performance in that game. He also, I think, lost whatever momentum he had that people were giving him. I don't think it was internal to the Vikings. I don't think they even thought about this. But, a lot of people were saying, hey, maybe Alex Boone shouldn't start. Maybe it should be Nick Easton. And I think his performance in that game alone tells us maybe that's a little bit premature. Beyond that, we saw, a lot of struggles from Rashad Hill. I think this is maybe the worst performance we've seen from Rashad Hill in, the preseason training camp last year, etc. It was just a really bad performance by him. And then a characteristically poor performance by Mike Remmers. And so we got a pretty good game from Joe Berger. We got a pretty good game from Pat Elflein. And we got like 3 really poor offensive linemen. So that was a big part of it. And then also I think Sam Bradford is a big part of it. That's kind of one of the issues I have with the PFF grade. So Bradford has a really high PFF grade, like 84.8 or something, pretty good. And I think that it really underestimates kind of what he needs to be able to do. PFF in this case seems to largely be grading whether or not his throw was accurate. And to his credit, he was very accurate in that game. He finished with an 81% completion rate. And then beyond that, there were 2 drops, right? And so his completion rate should have been even higher.
That's true. And the 2 drops that happened were relatively high leverage drops.
Right, yeah, exactly. They were drops that would have converted first downs. And so, yeah, he was accurate, but I think that it kind of misses kind of the larger point about his larger decision-making. The deepest pass that he's thrown in the preseason, and I think it was thrown in this game, it wasn't this game. No, it might have been. I'm getting the games confused now. Was a deep throw to Adam Thielen at the end of the 2-minute drill, which I swear was the 49ers game. Right? Do you remember that?
Yes, it was.
All right. So that was a deep throw to Adam Thielen in the middle of the 2-minute drill. And I am inclined to put not discount it, but put a qualifier on it, that it's the result of a broken play, and it's one that the 49ers were happy to give up because it ran out the clock. And so it resulted in no points on the drive. And so you take a look at that and you think, well, okay, if he has other examples of good deep throws, then maybe we can, count that one in his favor. If not, then it takes kind of somewhat extraordinary circumstances for him to be able to make those accurate passes deep downfield. You take a look at, his most explosive play from the preseason was a 68, 69 yarder to Stephon Diggs, where he threw the ball 38 yards downfield, but that was a blown coverage. So that's, you have to hit those throws. It's not as if, it's easy to hit those throws, but it's a lot easier for you to not be cautious about it, be aggressive about those throws. Well, then those throws aside, the deepest he threw the ball was 22 yards. He didn't have that many deep throws. His average, depth of completion over the preseason overall, or not average depth of completion, average depth of target over the preseason overall, and specifically in the 49ers game, was 7.0, which is really low. It's were it not for Alex Smith, it would be the lowest in the league last year. And also Sam Bradford, who had a 6.6 average depth of target last year. It's a really low. It's usually ranks 32 or 33 among quarterbacks in average depth of target. And that's something that we were told that the offense would be, much more assertive about, that they would throw deeper downfield, that they would make more explosive plays, and they really didn't do that. And in this game, I thought Bradford was a little bit too comfortable taking short passes or underneath passes when he didn't need to. In the second half of his performance, I thought that he improved that. And again, like you mentioned, those throws to Diggs were pretty high leverage. They should have converted. But at the same time, they also didn't leave a lot of room for yards after the catch. Over the past two games that he's played in, Bradford's been throwing some hospital balls, putting his receivers in danger and limiting, their ability to get yards after a catch. And those are the reasons that, despite really accurate throws from Bradford, as well as, problems with pocket presence and the problems with the offensive line, that the Vikings offense just isn't producing that much. I don't think the Vikings are like a 3 points a game team that they kind of demonstrated over the course of the preseason. I think things will improve. I think the offensive line in particular will improve. But that is kind of the genesis of the issues that a lot of people might have about the offense. And then defensively, I'm not super happy with what happened there either.
Okay, so just to go back to the offense for a quick second, we still haven't seen the final version of the offensive line. The week one offensive line never really had an opportunity to play together for much of a game in the preseason, right?
Yeah, I think we saw the week one offensive line play together for maybe 15 snaps with Riley Reif in there. Before, he came up with a small limp, was taken out of the game for, basically to protect him. He should be ready to start the game. And he looked pretty good. He only made 1 or 2 mistakes. And that's a pretty good rate of error for a left tackle. And that would resolve, the issues that you have along, sort of the left there. And then, without Alex Boone in for a lot of the games, you're left with Nick Easton. And, Easton is a very volatile offensive lineman. I tracked his offensive line plays. Extraordinary plays, you get a plus. Extraordinary failures, or almost any failure, actually, you get a minus. You count up the pluses, you count up the minuses, and subtract one from the other, and you kind of get, how good they are when they make highlight plays, and sort of, and just the total number of either tells you kind of how volatile or explosive they can be. And Nick Easton's by far the most volatile offensive lineman. He's the most likely between, I think, the four interior players, Alex Moon, Pat Elflein, Joe Berger, and himself, to make really good positive plays, which is really cool. But he's also the most likely to make these catastrophic errors. And I think for an offensive lineman, your catastrophic errors are just going to hurt you a lot more than those explosive plays will help you. And so you kind of want to minimize error. And so he's kind of a guy that, when he was playing guard, you saw some of those weaknesses along the offensive line. And Alex Boone has not been playing up to, his contract or anything like that. But I think he's been playing pretty well. And so you get Reef, you get Boone, you get Elflein in there. You get Berger, who has finally put together a pretty good game. Maybe he'll continue to put together some good games. And you've got 4 out of 5 offensive linemen that I think you can probably trust to not make too many errors. If you got one bad offensive lineman, that's not great, Mike Remmers. But teams have been able to control for that. Like, teams have been able to deal with having one bad offensive lineman. Even some really good offensive lines have dealt with one bad offensive lineman. The Raiders, for example, had to deal with Austin Howard at right tackle. And they had, a lot of people think, the best pass protecting line in the NFL last year. So, I think that I'm not saying that this offensive line is going to be top half or anything like that, but, there's a lot of room for you to say that this isn't, who they are or where they'll end up being over the course of the season.
Well, okay, but looking again at the, concept of explosive plays versus reducing mistakes, I get the feeling that the offensive line and Sam Bradford are kind of on opposite sides of the coin there. Like, Bradford is already in the preseason specifically trying to avoid mistakes and sacrificing, opportunities at downfield plays. In other words, he's basically the same known quantity that he was last year and the year before that and the year before that.
Yeah, I think so. And it's kind of interesting when you take a look at the different positions and what's required of them. And how good they are at those specific things. You're going to want more volatility from some players than you are from others. If you get an offensive lineman that makes no extraordinarily positive plays, but also just doesn't make a mistake, you've got an extraordinarily high value offensive lineman. If you're looking at a quarterback who does that, you're looking at maybe someone who is like Alex Smith on steroids, right? But you're not looking at someone who consistently makes explosive plays that wins games. Like, you're not looking at, Aaron Rodgers or, when Tom Brady needs to turn it on, he'll turn it on, that sort of stuff. So, your different qualities are expected at different positions, and error reduction is much more important along the offensive line than it is for quarterbacks. And, it's kind of weird when you put it like that, because it makes it seem like, Sam Bradford and Nick Easton maybe want to switch mentalities, which would be kind of funny. It's kind of a problem that, the offensive line, some players may be wired one way where they're more likely to give up mistakes, where those mistakes can have a bigger impact than, their bigger positive plays. Whereas the Vikings are already playing, especially with Sam Bradford at quarterback, with a little bit too much cautiousness. And that cautiousness is sometimes kind of like a false risk analysis, because that cautiousness sometimes comes on third down and forces punts. Like, if you've got 70% completion rate on third down and third and long in particular, and you're not converting those third and longs, those completions don't mean anything because you're still punting. So it's something that is kind of an interesting tension, and hopefully they find some way to like transmit the qualities of one to the other.
I was actually, don't ask me why, but I was at the Home Depot in Edina the other day looking for some backsplash for my kitchen. Actually, no, I was looking for a replacement tile for one that broke on my counter doing some ice experiments. But that's neither here nor there. I saw Sam Bradford while I was there. And I was like, aren't you Sam Bradford? Aren't you our quarterback? And he was like, quarterback for what? I was like, duh, the Minnesota Vikings. And he was like, oh, yeah. And I was like, what are you doing here? He was like, oh, I just need a 2-minute drill.
Oh, my God. It was so bad.
Yeah. But seriously, 2-minute drill.
Thanks, Dusty. We will cherish that joke forever.
Please don't. So you mentioned how you were not terribly impressed with the defense over the last couple of games. And I think that is a fair assessment. I think the line, the edge rushers, we've got the 2 of the 3 best edge rushers in the league. So, when the starters win, it was fine. But downfield, we're a hot mess right now. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. And in some ways, I think that defensively, a lot of the individual players for the Vikings performed, I think, worse than they will end up performing in the regular season. Because I think it's unlikely, for example, that Xavier Rhodes is going to play as poorly as he did in that game, or that Harrison Smith is going to make the mistakes that he made in that game. I think even, Mackenzie Alexander, who we're going to talk a lot more about a little bit later, I think that even he was making more errors than you would expect of him in the regular season, despite, kind of what we know of him as a potential, failure trying to redeem himself.
Well, I'm not convinced we'll get the chance to see the difference, but that's a story for later in the show.
Right. But yeah, we saw issues from like Trey Waynes. We saw some issues a little bit from Anthony Barr. It was not, the greatest time to watch that defense. And then, Tom Johnson up the middle when he was stopping the run was not very good at stopping the run. So we saw some problems there. And I think it's unlikely, and even Eric Kendricks had some problems. And I think it's unlikely that all of those players will continue to have problems going into the regular season. So, it was a comedy of errors. It was not great. I think the secondary was at fault for a lot of stuff, especially when you got the second and third team in there. But I think a lot of it is not, something that you could transfer onto your regular season expectations. I think we're going to see just a lot more from Xavier Rhodes, who did such a good job last year, or Harrison Smith, who's like one of the top safeties in the league, and so on. There's a lot of problems. There were a lot of tackling problems. Raheem Mostert, for example, did a great job taking a screen some like 80-odd yards to the house. And a lot of that had to do with tackling. And a lot of that had to do with, the way the Vikings coverage was working. The weak side linebacker spot is something that I think is still an open question. Like Ben Gideon looks really good as a run defender. But I think on one of those big, yards after catch runs, Gideon either bit too hard in the play fake or just didn't read what he needed to do in coverage correctly and was just well out of position and doesn't have, sort of the backwards moving athleticism necessary to get into position quickly enough. He was exploited in coverage. Evan Robinson, not just this game, but also the next game, the Miami game, looked pretty bad and out of position and kind of confused. And Emmanuel Lamur doesn't, I think, offer that much. And so I think all of those kind of also contributed to the relative success of the 49ers offense. And then, of course, in the Miami game, we saw a lot more of the problems in the secondary.
Okay, so was that just because the Miami game was purely a backup performance, or was it a carryover of the same problems that plagued us against San Francisco?
I think a little bit of both and neither. Like, I think that the backups, for example, played a lot worse than you'd hope the backups would. It, puts a lot of question into depth. Sam Brown, of course, just had a really bad time. He had like one good play and like 8 really bad ones where he just got burned. We didn't see, very good stuff from Jabari Price in that game. He actually had a pretty good game against San Francisco. But he had a pretty poor game against the Dolphins. He's competing for that 5th cornerback spot, or 6th, depending on if you count Marcus Sherrills. We're not really seeing, much from him. He had a really poor game. That calls into question, if he's the guy that a lot of people are thinking might end up being that last cornerback, he's the guy that a lot of people are thinking would represent the depth. And, that's why the Vikings may not have that much depth, especially because Terrence Newman, certainly looks like he's lost a step. I think it, kind of foretells the future in terms of, where the depth is headed. But I don't think it's just because they're backups. I mean, they were playing against backups, and they still should have done better. I don't think it's that. I think it's more that the depth problems in that part of the secondary kind of stand out. I thought the edge rushers again were pretty good. I thought the defensive line was pretty good. Jaleel Johnson had a great day. Dayton Jones, I thought he did well. Will Sutton had a great game. It's unfortunate, that they ended up getting cut. We saw a phenomenal game from Eric Wilson. But, those are isolated individual performances. This is the first preseason game where Jaron Kearse was asked to play, a little bit deeper a lot more often, and, he struggled in that role. This is, a game where we ended up seeing, even Mackenzie Alexander, who was largely good in coverage, ended up having this enormous mental mistake, a taunting error that ended up converting and creating a new first down, resulted in a touchdown. There was just like a lot of small errors that overwhelmed some of the greater individual performances in that game.
Well, okay. I have this theory that if we like zoom way out to like outer space view of these last 2 preseason games, we're looking at a Vikings team that runs a serious risk of playing either up or down to the competition that they're presented.
I think so. I think that's a reasonable interpretation of the shape of the preseason. I'm not sure that all of that's going to carry over. I don't know. Like it's not quite an issue, or it was a little bit of an issue last year, but it's not really quite an issue for generally speaking Mike Zimmer coach teams. Nor do I think that a lot of the individual players tend to have that quality. I think it's just kind of how things turned out. Like for example, the Vikings should have scored more points were it not for like luck, for example, or uncharacteristic errors. Like a false start on Kyle Rudolph took them out of the red zone. That's something that won't repeat itself in the regular season, or on a consistent basis. But yeah, this is definitely based off of what we've seen. A team that seems to be attracted to going 500 because of the likelihood of playing up or down to your competition, and that's not great.
Okay, but if you weren't playing up to the level of your competition in a game where you're suddenly down a touchdown +1 to San Francisco in the preseason, then you don't get a play like Taylor Heineke scrambling and diving like right at the pylon in order to get the 2-point conversion that gives the Vikings the 1-point win.
Yeah, but like the guys who played up to their competition are mostly guys who are not going to be on the team. So if that's a quality that the backups have, it's not necessarily a quality that the starters have.
All right, Arif Wet Blanket Hassan. Okay, but just to talk a tiny bit more about that play, like going for 2 there in the preseason is like the only play, right? Like why would you?
Yeah, for sure.
Why would you
I think
play
Bruce
for a tie in
Arians
a
said,
preseason
I think it's
game?
illegal to go for a tie in the preseason. Good point, Bruce Arians. Mike Zimmer agrees. In the middle of a kicking competition, too. Yeah, screw that. We're leaving. I love that.
Nope, we're just going to take the win and go home. And frankly, we needed the morale boost given how ugly the Miami game was. But did you get the sense that the Miami game was like maybe winning was not the number one goal for Mike Zimmer, and he was more interested in like hashing out some second level personnel battles?
Maybe. He tends to take a lot of these preseason games as opportunities to practice game management, and in order to do that, you need to at least be concerned with the concept of winning a little bit. But yeah, the priorities do shift, and like what you care about matters, and how that determines who you're playing and how you're playing them, matters. So yeah, like winning is still not important, but it's definitely been important enough that he gets angry when the team collectively underperforms, that he, manages the clock correctly and stuff like that. So yeah, it changes the priorities, but sometimes you put a cornerback in a tough position to see how he'll do. That's not conducive to winning, and it's more conducive to player evaluation. So there's definitely a bit of both there.
Mike Zimmer, I think, had a great quote in his like very brief halftime interview during the Miami game. I forget the guy's name. He works for KFan. The sideline reporter for KFan was like, so how do you feel about your team having all these young guys on it? And Zimmer was like, well, they all look like young guys out there, given how many mistakes they made.
Yeah. He was not happy.
Well, can't imagine why when a taunting penalty costs you a touchdown. Is that so? Okay, but seriously, is that the end of Mackenzie Alexander? Like, was that the like he was decent in training camp, if I recall correctly, and he's kind of been underperforming consistently in every preseason game.
If you think about it this way, though, if you took his taunting penalty away, which it obviously happened, but for the purposes of projection, if you just ask how he played and say there's a reasonable chance he won't commit those same errors again and again in the regular season. Just take a look at how he played. He played really well in that game. And so, Yeah, he's got this history of like poor play. It just sucks. Like it was such a dumb move, and the idea that he could do the Vikings? I mean, we'll talk about this a little bit more in a second. But do the Vikings trade for Tremaine Brock if he doesn't commit that taunting penalty? Maybe. Like it's an actual question. And in fairness, like the trade only opened up because the Seahawks were able to get another cornerback through another trade. But yeah, it's just weird. But he played well, and you want to project that too. And it's so annoying. I'm annoyed at him, not at people who talk about it. I'm annoyed at him for just screwing it up by doing something that I'm not going to say is uncharacteristic of him. He's a super confident guy, but will probably be uncharacteristic of him going into the future. So yeah, I don't know if it's the end of him because he played really well in that game, but it's much easier for you to try and find competition for your guy if your guy's the one that costs you a touchdown for a stupid mistake.
Well, and taunting in a preseason game, dude, could you do any less?
Yeah, right. At least
Right.
I'll give him this. At least he was responsible for the play. There's so many instances where I see cornerbacks celebrating and taunting where they're in no way responsible for what happened, and you're just like, come on, chill out. It's ridiculous. You're embarrassing yourself.
Exactly.
In this case, he also embarrassed himself, but at least he had something to do with it.
At least he did not embarrass himself for not having any... Whatever. Good job, Mackenzie.
Can you imagine if he had taunted, if he had nothing, if it was just an overthrow?
He'd been cut already. Speaking of cuts, we contemplated taping last night after the Norse Code Fantasy Draft and the Miami game. But, I mean, mostly me. I was just like, dude, this game was terrible. The fantasy draft was terrible. I don't know what I want to say. There isn't really that much to say. We could just I guess we could have gotten on the horn and complained about how terrible everything was, but we waited 24 hours and we were rewarded with giant gold star bouquets of cuts and trades because apparently the new 90 to 53 man roster thing in one day creates this weird Black Friday pre-sale news glut a day before the 53 man thing happens because it turns out at least 2 days to fully cut down your roster.
All those people.
So we've had a chance to review kind of the day 1 of 2 cuts, and I don't know. Let's take a look. I mean, for me, the most disappointing one is the waiver of Moritz Boehringer. Womp womp.
Yeah, disappointing, but certainly not surprising by any means.
No, I mean, for a guy that had zero experience in the NFL 2 years ago, he's learned an awful lot, and a lot has been made of kind of how much he has learned in this offseason in particular, but not enough.
Yeah, not enough. I was excited to see sort of how much he had learned. Because it was a pretty significant amount. He has improved pretty substantially, but certainly not enough to make a team.
Also gone from the wide receiver department, R.J. Shelton, who
waived injured, I guess. He could end up on injured reserve for the Vikings. It sounded like he had fractured his foot, which certainly news to me. He ended up taking, I think, the final kickoff return for the Vikings in that Miami game, and so he must have, injured it about then.
Yes, actually, oh my gosh. I'm not going to be able to attribute it correctly, but there are reports that Shelton is on injured reserve.
Well, he will be. He has to pass through waivers first. It's a weird process.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Terrell Newby will not be sharing running back duties with everybody else. Oh, random Latavius Murray sighting in the Miami game. That was all right.
Yeah, he did well. Yeah, I mean, he didn't have much of a chance to make the roster, but and I doubt he'll make the practice squad. But he's a guy that's going to be on the Vikings' radar if something happens to the first 2 running backs. The fact that he knows the system, he's been with them and has played reasonably well enough means that they might call him. So that's what you get out of it.
Mitch Leidner, not officially cut. Do you think he's turned on his Uber Eats app or whatever service he was driving for before? Do you think he's already like contemplating getting back in the car and delivering tacos?
You might have to, man. I don't know. NFL players are notoriously delusional. So he might think that he played his way into a contract, but I think that you and I are of the same mind here that no, he did not.
Yeah, Mitch, if you're listening, we love you, but maybe next year. Josiah Price out. Bucky Hodges still hanging on. Do you think that lasts?
Yeah, I think Bucky Hodges is going to be around for a bit. Yeah, it sounded like Nick Truesdell was also released. So that's both. I mean, that kind of clears out. We're really just waiting on whether or not Kyle Carter makes the roster because the rest of the tight end room is already set. Vikings like Kyle Carter a lot. I thought he looked really good in camp, a lot better than he did last year. And he could be sort of an all-around tight end that might have the ability to block as well as receive. So that's really the question we're asking about the tight ends. And then kind of related to that sometimes is the fullback question, whether or not they're going to keep C.J. Ham. So we don't know about that yet as far as I can tell. They mostly just got rid of people who were running with the third stringers. So people like Sam Brown, who just had an abysmal night. Chunky Clements, which is a name that is real. Will Sutton, who has played really, really well for the Vikings. Hot and cold, honestly, but for a third or fourth string defensive tackle, I think that he acquitted himself really, really well, and especially turned it on in that Miami game. Sam McCaskill out, Moritz Sporinger, we already mentioned that. Trey Roberson, Noor Davis. Noor Davis was a guy that they signed partway through camp after it became clear that Sean Washington wasn't going to be healthy, and so they just signed him. It's not surprising that he didn't end up making the team. Trey Roberson, my guy. That was, that was totally expected. He just hasn't been playing well. He had a really good rookie year, transitioning to the cornerback position, but he didn't grow enough. And then, I think everybody's kind of aware that TJ Clemmings has been cut. It's the end of an era.
Finally, the end of an era that was not noteworthy to begin with. It was like King Toman's run as Lord of the First Men.
Something like Hobbesian here to say, but it was like life was short, brutal, and
nasty,
cruel.
brutish, and short.
There it is, nasty, brutish, and short.
It's is how Hobbes views all of human existence. Well, thankfully,
in the NFL, that is largely true.
Thankfully, we have enough competent bodies behind him now to let him go, along with Freddie Tagaloa, who I think was functionally a camp body. Does he have a shot at the practice squad?
I don't think so. He's a guy that I kept my eye on just because the Vikings have been very, very generous to the guys that made the 90-man as a tryout. They didn't get a contract. They had to earn a contract and unseat somebody who already had a contract. He's one of those guys. And very often, they've given them, preference in practice squad assignments. They've given them, promotions and stuff like that. They're guys that they tend to like a lot because they've already proved themselves once. Adam Thielen and Marcus Sherrills are both, good examples of that. But no, I don't really think so. He was playing at the bottom of the roster, and he looked really good in rookie minicamp, and then he looked really poor in training camp up against the veterans, and so it didn't look like he was going to move himself up.
So, cornerback is kind of an interesting spot for the Vikings right now. Customarily, a team only needs like 5 to 7 D-backs, right?
Well, 5 to 7 cornerbacks, and then like 3 to 5 safeties. So
okay, so 11 total, approximately.
Yeah, 9 to 11.
Currently, we have when the sun came up this morning, we had 11 cornerbacks.
Yeah, when the sun went down, they had 11.
That seems like too many. And then we hired another one.
No, they got rid of one. They got rid of Jabari Price. So they hired one, got rid of Jabari Price. You're back at 11.
Well, no. Actually, we're down to 10 now. Down to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Oh, and
6,
they got
7,
rid of Trey Roberson.
8. Yeah, and Sam Brown. Yeah.
See, look at that. we're making progress.
Well, exactly my point. Like what? So there's two guys on this list. With the inclusion of Tremaine Brock, there's Mackenzie Alexander, Terrence Newman, Xavier Rhodes, Marcus Sherrills, Trey Waynes. Those guys, except for Alexander, are probably all guaranteed first billing, right? Like Sinkfield, Alexander, and Richardson, and maybe Newman, depending on his sturdiness, are probably closer to the exit door than the field, right?
Yeah, and that's kind of projecting a lot with Newman, but it's something I think the Vikings should seriously consider, given just how far it seems like he's fallen.
Well, okay, so let me stop you right there. It's easy to say that Mackenzie Alexander lost his job when he got that dumb penalty, but
it's certainly easy now.
Well,
to
yeah.
Say it.
Okay, but chances are the Vikings have 2 or 3 people in mind that they don't expect to finish the season at cornerback, and that makes the Tremaine Brock, given his relative skill at slot corner, which has been a position of need. I mean, do you really want Marcus Sherrills at slot corner all year?
Right.
For a couple of years, but he's also shown some skill on either side as well. I think he's better on the right than the left, if I'm remembering what I read today.
Well, I don't recall him playing that much in the slot. Mostly I recall him playing on the outside, and I do not have a recollection of him playing the right or the left more often than the other. So mostly I was just looking to see, if he played on the outside a lot or played on the inside a lot. And from my memory, he didn't actually play in the slot that much, but for some reason I couldn't watch any of his 2015 stuff. I don't know why. It just was inaccessible to me. So, if he played the slot then and he played it well, that'd be good. He certainly has the kind of size the Vikings were looking for in the slot. He's 5'10", a little bit heavier, 196. They like taller guys on the outside, so I don't think that they're going to end up giving him that many reps on the outside. But I think, he offers versatility, right? And that's pretty important. So, if Trey Waynes goes down, they'll put, him on the outside and then bring Mackenzie Alexander up. Or if Mackenzie Alexander goes down and Mackenzie was starting, then he's, kind of meant to play in that position. I don't know. He's generally a top 20 cornerback who was just available on the free market after charges against him were dropped, domestic violence charges. And so he signed with the Seattle Seahawks. 2 weeks later, they trade him. The Vikings were already trying to sign him. They couldn't. After refusing to sign with the Vikings, he finds himself forced to play for the Vikings. I don't know. It's kind of interesting. He is. I'm not really sure. A lot of writers are probably correct when they're saying, he's probably going to start at that nickel spot for where Mackenzie Alexander was. And I get it. I'm a little bit apprehensive because I just haven't seen him play in the slot. But I get it. That makes sense to me. But I wouldn't be surprised. Again, he was traded for a 7th round pick. I wouldn't be surprised if his value just kind of dictated that he's going to sit for a bit, and they're going to let Mackenzie Alexander play out his spot until he proves in regular season games that he doesn't deserve it. In which case, you've got somebody right there who's going to take over.
Well, that's kind of the thing, though, right? Is that at cornerback, we've got 3 guys, maybe 4 guys that are kind of on the bubble. Like Terrence Newman is going to be great until his body fails him. Marcus Sherrills is going to be Marcus Sherrills. Terrell Sinkfield will be an acceptable backup. Trey Waynes is Trey Waynes. And Mackenzie Alexander is, not terribly great. I mean, Brock could step in for any one of those guys should, injury or just, failure to succeed plague them.
Yeah, and I would imagine that, Sinkfield, who is probably the best of the guys that were not likely to make the roster, is now certainly not going to make it because of Tremaine Brock. You'd end up with, I want to say 6 cornerbacks, right? Because you got Waynes, Rhodes, Newman, Alexander, and then Sherrills as your 5. And then you've got Brock as your 6th, which that's going to create some pressure on the safeties because 11 defensive backs is kind of at the very high end. I've seen teams do it. The Vikings, I'm not sure have done it, but I know Mike Zimmer has. And that means 4 safeties instead of 5. With how Anton Exum has been playing, both as a guy who can actually back up in the slot. He's doing pretty well in the slot. And as a guy who's much improved at safety, you got to ask, hey, is he going to make the team despite all these improvements? Because, teams tend to count by the total number of defensive backs and less by how many cornerbacks versus how many safeties. So I'm kind of curious to see how that plays out. I ended up putting a 53-man roster on zonecoverage.com, prediction at the beginning of the day, where the Vikings did add a cornerback, not the one that I guessed. I guessed it was going to be Phillip Gaines from Kansas City. But they added a corner, and they also added a linebacker. So they ended up with 7 linebackers and 11 defensive backs on my list. And so I ended up having to say, well, you can only have 8 defensive linemen then. And that was fine because I was able to trade, in my imagination, Stephen Weatherly. And I also had to cut out one of the tight ends, in that case, Kyle Carter. And so there could be a lot of roster pressure from this signing, because it's very likely you'll end up with 6 cornerbacks. That eliminates any possibility for Terrell Sinkfield to make the team. I think he's a really good, practice squad candidate again, because of just how well he played in camp and in the preseason. And it puts a lot of pressure, like we said, on Mackenzie Alexander's spot to start. I don't know what the plan is right now. Like, I don't know if, and a lot of writers are pretty confident this is the case, so they're probably right, if Tremaine Brock is meant to start right away, or if he's meant as a guy who's going to sit and wait and see what happens with either Waynes or Alexander, or injury just in general, and then pick a spot. Because, again, he's a top 20 cornerback, but his price or his value may imply that the Vikings are just comfortable waiting and treating him like depth for a little bit.
It's true. He was V cheap. I think he was like $685,000 a year or something.
Yeah, he signed, I think, for basically vet minimum. And he only cost the Vikings a 7th round pick in addition. So, they're not super invested. And, he's a suspension risk. I think he is going to be suspended by I'm not sure. Because even if charges are dropped, the NFL is free to suspend players, which we'll be learning in some exciting fashion following the Ezekiel Elliott case. So, yeah.
Case is a very charitable way to put it.
Exciting. Well, it's going to be important for me because I'm aiming to win the Norse Code League, and I've got Ezekiel Elliott.
By the way,
that was prescient. Drafted him well before any announcement.
Well, I woke up 10 minutes late for the draft. I should not have taken that nap, because not only did I wake up late for the draft, but I couldn't get my app organized, and I just the way that my pick worked out, I missed my first 3 picks. And I would have taken Zeke Elliott before you did.
Yeah, I bet.
But I didn't.
But you didn't. When you said, because you told me beforehand you were going to take that nap, and I was like, Dusty might miss the draft because of the snap he's going to take. I'm not going to tell him anything. And I didn't. I would not have known how to wake you up anyway.
I didn't miss the whole draft, just the first 3 picks.
Yeah, just the most important part.
Well, thankfully, Yahoo hooked me up with wide receivers.
Good. I'm glad.
I'm as glad as our listeners for us talking about fantasy. Fun fact about Tremaine Brock, he is a former Golden Gopher. In 2 days, how many former Golden Gophers are going to be on the Vikings?
I think 2 if you count Marcus Sherrills.
Larger point is that the Vikings are not long for Mitch Leidner.
Right. Are there any other former Gophers besides Mitch Leidner? I'm gonna look through this. There's a lot of Minnesotans, right? There's Adam Thielen and C.J. Ham and Michael Floyd. It's kind of weird.
As far as I know, which is not far, Brock and Leidner are the only former Gophers on what currently exist as the Vikings.
Besides Marcus Sherrills. You keep forgetting him, man.
And Marcus Sherrills, yes.
Oh, wait, Isaac Frichte.
And Isaac Frichte.
Who's also not going to be on the team. So 2.
That's true. Frichte had a soft showing in the Miami game. Not that was what his career turned on, but...
Yeah, there was... The only player who could have possibly made a push to be on the roster was Rodney Adams, and he didn't. Caleb Jones, I think, got real close. He had such a great game. But yeah, don't think he'll make it. Plus, I think he'll survive waivers. So, double the reason to practice squad him.
Yes. So I will direct our listeners to your zone coverage article about your 53-man roster prediction, unless you would like to amend it or any parts of it right here.
No, that's not how it works. I gotta get it graded as is.
Okay.
But I will count the fact that they added a cornerback not on the roster as a win.
Yeah, that's like if this was a Geeks Who Drink and that was like a 2-point trivia question, you would get 1 point.
Yeah, see, there you go.
Well, all right. We've got a relatively short mailbag this week. I guess because all the news that happened today has already been like aggressively dissected on Twitter, and that's where we go for questions. At any rate, Tommy Gunn, former official Norse Code question asker, writes in, as the Vikings are about halfway through their cuts, what are your thoughts about cutting pizza grid style? Should you ever, if the pizza is not thin crust?
So my take, which I wouldn't be surprised if you disagreed, is only for square-shaped pizzas that are not thin crust. So Sicilian style is really good. But yeah, I think if it's a circle pizza that's not a thin crust, and it's not a relatively thin crust, like what Domino's calls Brooklyn style, even though, whatever. Because I like that cut into squares because it's not actually New York style pizza, so I'm okay with it not being in slices. If it gets up like any thicker, like hand tossed or pan, then yeah, that's weird. Don't do that. But if it's thin crust or thin-ish, like the national market Brooklyn styles, then yeah, squares are better than slices in that case.
I would be remiss if I did not mention Pizza Hut's Bigfoot pizza, which was a pan-style crust served in like a 1 foot by 2 foot box.
I think I remember. That was a while ago, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was.
I think I remember that.
That was literally video game fuel, along with like Jolt Cola, which is also making a comeback for 13-year-old Dusty and his dumb friends.
It's bringing back memories.
So beyond nostalgia purposes, I think the only excuse for cutting pizza grid style is if you have like one giant pizza and like 10 kids to feed. Like if you cut a 24-inch pizza into grid style, that's like 600 pieces of pizza. I didn't do the math.
No, I think thin crust pizza tastes better square cut.
Well, for me, it's not so much about taste as it is just like practicality. Like if you've got 15 children to feed, whether they're debate students or theater kids or a church group or whatever, square cut's the way to go because you can get 2 squares of pizza, which is still probably like area wise about 1 radial slice, but it's 2 pieces. And so if you're like the chaperone of these people, you have to deal with less bitching, and that is that has a value greater than money. Yeah. So
yeah, fair enough.
I think outside the Bigfoot and outside of feeding a large crowd of easily trickable people, I think slices are the way to go. But I'm definitely like I think for me the cutoff is either like an outsized rectangular pizza like the Bigfoot or a round pizza that's 24 inches or larger. Then I think grid style is the way to go. Matt McKeon writes in, my dream is to see Teddy play the London game. How realistic / delusional is that?
It's pretty delusional. Although, I would love that for so many reasons.
Your dream.
Right. Yeah, right.
However, I am not that delusional. And frankly, I don't think the Vikings should.
Right. Yeah. I think that all of the soft indications we're getting, and they're super soft, like they're like rumors and hearsay and whatever, are that Teddy's ahead of schedule. That's great. That
Don't
to
care.
me doesn't mean
Don't
that
care.
he's going to play.
Take 3 extra weeks. Don't.
Right.
Do not push his development.
Right. So I think that, unless you're in a catastrophic situation where A, you're very comfortable where Teddy is at, and B, Sam Bradford has died again on the field, and it's been a good amount of time, and he's gone through all the athletic tests you need anyway, and then he was already off the pup. Like, taking him off the pup to do a thing, that would suck. Taking him off the pup naturally, if he's ready, that's much different, and you should wait as long as possible unless, hey, the Vikings are, what is the line of the game? Week 9, week 10?
8.
Can't be week 10. I think that's yeah. So the Vikings are like 5-3 in the middle of a wild card / division race. So I guess 5-2, or 4-3. That's closer. And they're in the middle of like a wild card or division race, and and they need a quarterback to get out the rest of the season. I'm probably turning to Teddy if he's all cleared and healthy. But even in that situation, I'm not going to take Teddy off of the pup in order to, because that I think implies a rush, and that would indicate that maybe he wasn't ready and had a high chance of re-injury. So I think in some situations, it would make sense, but I think those situations are really unlikely, even though Sam Bradford is an injury magnet. So yeah, I would think it's pretty unrealistic.
Well, and dude, who cares? They're playing the Browns. Why would you bring anyone off of any list to play the Browns?
Because Deshaun Kaiser's the next Hall of Fame quarterback, Dusty. Come on.
For the Browns,
they cut Brock Osweiler. So.
Oh my God, that makes me so happy. Like,
oh, did you not know about this? Yeah,
no, I did. And the best part is just like thinking about how Brock is like, he's like the new Jay Cutler. Like, he did even less. He's not even married to his supermodel, and all he has to do is sit on his couch and play Madden.
He's not even married to a supermodel.
Like, right? Like Jay Cutler at least like got paid and married a supermodel and had a couple of kids he apparently doesn't like, and like took up a cigarette habit. Like, I don't know. Brock Osweiler can literally get paid $2 million a week to look at the cover of Madden with Julian Edelman on it and laugh.
Okay, so this is what I always find interesting about football players. I mean, just generally speaking, football is so freaking difficult, and I don't know how you don't just go the John Urschel route, where like you play, you're kind of a backup, you might play, you get a couple $1 million, and then you retire. Like, props, man. Really respect what you did, Urschel. I get that, like, for a lot of players, like, football is all that they have, and so like it's more than just pursuing a paycheck. But like Brock Osweiler is almost assuredly going to try and get another job, and he's not going to make more money because of it, because there's offsets in the contract. Like, he's just going to make the same amount of money because the Browns either owe him that money or they owe whatever the difference is between his next contract and this one. But he's going to want to play, and he's going to look bad, and he might get hurt. I hear it's a violent game.
He's going to get paid.
Brock, have you thought about pursuing your other passions? You got a couple $1 million.
Yeah, a couple.
Yeah, like at least a solid 16.
Yeah, 20 is a couple, right?
Yeah, 20 is a couple.
Well, it speaks to the weirdness of like markets for scarce goods. Like at least with the Hurricane Harvey stuff, we're releasing strategic oil to prevent like major like spikes or dips in the price of fuels, because it turns out the Gulf Coast manufactures a lot of fuel.
Huh.
Unfortunately, colleges can't just release like 30 quarterbacks into the NFL.
Yeah, let's get into a strategic quarterback reserve.
Exactly. There's no strategic reserve of people. I mean, other than like Ryan Fitzgerald.
Well, I mean, there is Colin. Put that out there.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, but
what's amazing about this Brock Osweiler thing, though, is that now there's like another reason that Colin Kaepernick's not going to get signed this season.
I know, and John Mara was like, well, people have very strong feelings about Colin Kaepernick. As though they don't have strong feelings about his team being garbage every year. Like, that's, it's a question of priorities. Maybe there are maybe all those guys that are like, well, I think they should have drafted this dude from Missouri State. Maybe all the all the D2 quarterbacks deserve their shot, but not for $20 million a year.
Brock Osweiler's definitely getting another job by the end of the year, man.
Oh, if he does, it's only as a backup.
If you say so.
He's not even good enough to be the starter for the Browns, and they owe him so much money. Like, he must really stink.
Well, I mean, the Browns basically figured that they'd get a second-round pick, right? I mean, that's all they paid for, really. It's not like they planned to cut him. They were just like, we've got an extra $10 million in cap space lying around. You've already paid most of the cash, so we don't even have to pay $10 million cash. We're going to pay $10 million cap, get a second-round pick, and we're probably going to cut him. We're going to give him a chance to see if he should be cut. Yeah, he deserves to be cut. So, it's not like the Browns were like, you're so bad, you can't play for us. And they drafted a quarterback. They want to play that quarterback. They were just like, wow, you're a movable asset.
Well, yeah, but they still cut him.
Fair point.
For whatever, I mean, everybody talked about the deal as though it were some sort of crazy NBA style trick that the Browns front office played on the league. But at the end of the day,
I still think it was.
I mean, and it is, and I mean, it clearly Brock getting cut kind of like proves that point. But for at least 5 minutes, Brock's destiny was in his own hands. And he
that's a good point. Yeah, he
threw
played
it
in
into
the
the
preseason.
stands.
He had an
like
off-season program.
So
I almost feel bad for the guy, but then I remember $20 million.
Yeah. Don from Ohio writes in, what kind of food spread do you recommend for the first Sunday of the NFL season?
Remember, Don from Ohio, formerly Jay-Z Hoodie, didn't he ask like a ton of questions? Not just Kyle, but now Don.
No, soft mailbag performance this week, even from our trolls.
All right.
Mirroring
so what
Miami
kind of
game.
Food spread does he recommend for just a game?
For the first Sunday of the NFL season. He does not specifically mention the Vikings game, but I have a Viking-specific answer. And
you go with yours then.
It might be a little bit difficult to execute because you got to figure out a way to like have the game on outdoors. But crawfish boil.
Oh, that's exactly what I was. Okay, fantastic. I was like, is it too New Orleans-y? But no, it's perfect.
No, well, when is a crawfish boil ever not perfect? And if you can't get crawfish by the pound, get crab by the pound and do a crab boil instead. Whatever it is, bring a giant roll of brown paper and a ton of Old Bay seasoning and go in the park and do it. And find someone that has like a tablet with like Sunday Ticket on it and like put that on a stick so the game is on. Listen to it on the radio. But
put up a screen, project it on. Yeah. So there's 2 reasons I like. 3 reasons. The first is that it tastes delicious. Get that out of the way. Second reason, of course, is that I think it's not celebrating the Saints so much as eating them, and that's great. Third, Adrian Peterson's allergic to shellfish. Let's eat shellfish.
I did not know the third thing, but now I would like to double down on my answer.
See, there you go. Crawfish boil.
Don from Ohio follows up. How do you feel about me going undefeated in your fantasy football league?
Great. Everybody should have dreams.
One does not simply walk into Mordor.
Can you check who his kicker is? I need to know who to cheer against every week.
It doesn't matter. Hoodie is smart enough to rotate through kickers week by week.
Yeah, right. So we can't jinx them. Yeah, fair enough.
As far as I know, nobody drafted Mason Crosby, which I think was James's fatal mistake last year.
No, I think someone did. I'm pretty confident someone drafted Mason Crosby, and then someone also drafted Blair Walsh. This is a great league.
Well, whoever drafted Blair Walsh, may the Lord have mercy on your soul. But Mason Crosby actually significantly underperformed. I think he actually might have missed more extra points last year than Blair Walsh did.
That's brutal.
I know. We'll actually, I'll revisit this point next week when James is on for the 3-man pod, just so we can all experience his unspoken misery through our headphones.
Soon to be spoken.
And finally, John Judick writes, I didn't get to watch the game, but what is the best sound effect you can make to sum it up for me? He's speaking of the Miami preseason game.
Like besides
That's what I figured you would go with. Mine is...
Is there like a resigned dolphin? Because that was like a very resigned horse noise, but it's the Miami Dolphins. Yeah, that's definitely a sheep, but I'm not going to outdo it, so we'll go with that.
I'm going to stick with the actually I want you to cue up the Steve Spurrier gif while I go. That's because that is what it was. Well, all right, that was surprisingly concise.
Yeah, short mailbag.
Short mailbag. Not really much to say. The preseason game sucked. We're going to end up with
the players
who
got cut were the players we expected to get cut.
They were who we thought they were.
Yeah, it's not going to be interesting until tomorrow. See what happens then.
Well, we will return sometime between then and the first game of the season. Which reminds me, all y'all with iPhones or Macintosh computation devices or whatever, please go to iTunes, go to the podcast store, look up Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings, and give us a 5-star rating. We're still collecting them in our contest with Titletown Sound Off. A decent chunk of money. There have actually been a lot of ratings. And the one thing I didn't do before this episode was see who was winning. But a significant chunk of money will either be donated to the Mike Zimmer Foundation if we win, or the Alzheimer's Association if we don't win. But it would really feel better to win. So please leave us a 5-star rating, and you can leave a review if you want, but the 5-star rating is key. That's all we're counting. So go to the podcast store on iTunes and leave us one of those. Beyond that, you've got your fully baked 53-man roster prediction. Is there anything else you're working on at the moment?
At the moment, I don't think so. I had a thing in mind, and I've already forgotten it, so it seems like it's not that important.
Yeah, it must have been really good. It must have been really insightful. Well, either way, we will return in advance of the Saints game with a 3-man pod featuring more than you ever cared to know about a fantasy league that you're not in, and probably some hot fire Adrian Peterson takes. There will definitely be at least one camel reference. Beyond that, I can't promise much.
Next time on Norse Code. Camels.
A man is riding a camel. You'll never guess whom. No,
that makes it sound like, when you say whom, that makes it sound like which camel is he riding, not which man is it.
Wow, that actually would be the harder one to guess. I think everybody's good on half of that 50-50. But until then, demand excellence. Demand Norse Code. And we'll see you then.